A reading from the book of Job, chapter 38, beginning at verse 1. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed bounds for it, and set bars and doors, and said, Thus far shall you come, and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stopped. This is the word of the Lord. A reading from the Gospel according to St. Mark, chapter 4, beginning at verse 35. When evening had come, Jesus said to the disciples, Let us go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great gale arose and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be now and always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I often hear people say how much they enjoy a holiday on a cruise. It might be a river cruise or a trip around the Mediterranean or the Caribbean. And there is no shortage of luxury upon these floating hotels. And I understand how appealing this must be. And so for most, the sea conjures up delightful images, whether it's cruising or simply taking a stroll by the seashore. Modern images of the sea are typically tame and inviting, lulling us into associating the sea with a sense of tranquility. But what if we were back in Galilee over 2,000 years ago? The sea in today's Gospel reading is not a place for romantic cruises on crystal blue waters. At that time, the waters were believed to be inhabited by sea monsters, and there was always the threat that fishermen would not return home again as they tried to make their living. The sea in Mark's Gospel is where discipleship is challenged, where boundaries are impassable, where life hangs in the balance, and where evil lurks as a formidable foe. Storms happen even to the best, the smartest, and the most prepared among us. Storms terrify us, knocking us around, threatening to destroy our stability and also our security. We don't know whether we can withstand them, and we are uncertain of how long they will last. At least that's how a storm at sea would be for most of us. And that is how it was for the disciples. At the end of a long day of teaching and healing, Jesus needs a break, and he initiates a trip across the Sea of Galilee. Although the water is usually calm, the wind coming over the surrounding mountains can suddenly raise a frightening storm. Even with Jesus on board, the disciples still encountered tremendous gusts of wind. There was no avoiding this storm. Even as they faithfully followed Jesus' instructions to cross the water to the other side, they were beaten by waves. Even though surrounded by other boats, the wind howled, lightning flashed, rain poured, thunder boomed, and the boat seemed to be sinking. And the disciples were absolutely terrified that they would perish, and Jesus was asleep on a cushion, no less. So they cry out, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And it is then that Jesus calms the sea with the words, "Peace, be still." We may have never crossed the Sea of Galilee, but we've been in the boat. The story is not just a story about a boat trip and stormy weather. It's a story about life, our fear, and our faith. Times of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger have often been compared to stormy seas. And they come upon us whether we like it or not. And of course, we can avoid some storms by watching the weather forecast and using some common sense. We can avoid some emotional, spiritual, financial, and social disasters by being wise and following God's instructions. But sometimes bad things just happen, even when we are minding our own business, doing what's right, and living our lives to the best of our ability with God's help. Sometimes life places us in a boat and the storms begin to rage. The storms of pain and loss, the storms of rejection and failure, the storms of illness and death, the storms of pandemic, storms brought on by racial and political unrest. Whenever or however they arise, storms bring about life-changing conditions. Life becomes overwhelming and out of control. The waves crash, the boat fills up, and we struggle to stay afloat. For more than a year now, the storm of pandemic has taken us to uncharted waters. We have a desired destination, but are not sure of where we will end up or when we will get there. The water is deep, and the new shore is a distant horizon. When the wind ceased and the waves became calm, Jesus questioned the disciples' fear and lack of faith. It is worth noting that Jesus never said, "There's nothing to be afraid of." The storm in the Sea of Galilee that night must have been extremely frightening if seasoned fishermen doubted their own ability to keep the boat afloat. We often confuse the two phrases, but saying there's nothing to be afraid of is quite different from saying do not be afraid. The truth is that things that cause fear are very real indeed. Isolation, pain, viruses, the loss of one's job or loss of relationship, illness and death, these are all real. Like the disciples in our text today, we are also challenged to rediscover our faith in God when we find ourselves in the midst of a storm. The questions Jesus asks the disciples are the questions he continues to ask us. Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? As we grow in faith, we come to understand that the things that cause us despair do not have the last word. Yet faith does not eliminate, change, or take us around the storms of our lives. Rather, faith takes us through the storms, reminding us that Jesus is always there with us. We are reminded that the power of God is mightier than any wind that beats against us, that the love of God is deeper than any wave that threatens to drown us. Jesus invites us to stay with him in the boat, saying, "Let us go across to the other side. I won't leave you. I'll journey with you." And let's not forget that Jesus was not addressing only one disciple when he invited them on their boat trip. He addressed all 12. And Mark tells us that there were other boats with him as well. So they were in community. If the past year has taught us anything, it is the importance of community. And people have worked so hard to stay connected to their communities, even while apart. Just as the disciples set off for the other shore with Jesus in the stern, we too journey with our community, accompanied by the Master of the ocean and earth and skies, who promises, "The winds and the waves shall obey my will. Peace, be still." So when the storms of life toss us to and fro, may we be reminded that the Master of the winds and the waves is present in every storm, and his response is always the same: "Peace, be still." Amen.